I am Sophie Kwasny. I work for the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. I'm delighted to be here, actually. The Council of Europe has been contributing to the CPDP conferences for a while now. I would like to thank Paul de Hert in particular and his dream team. We think the CPDP conference is a great occasion to always also recall the Data Protection Day. It's the 9th edition this year. And Paul always organizes the event the week before, so we can all be back at home to celebrate Data Protection Day, so next week on Wednesday. So we are here to speak about LGBT+, because we first started with a number of letters in the acronym, and then we thought, okay, let's try to keep it simple. LGBT+ will encompass everything. So LGBT+ and digital rights. Last year, the Council of Europe tried also to address a topic which is a bit out of the main tracks. It's the case again this year. Last year, we were speaking about internet governance. Digital rights of LGBT, as our speakers will tell you, is a topic which is not often discussed. There are, of course, problems in the field of privacy, freedom of expression, and a number of other rights. We really want to highlight the importance for academic, for research, to work more on this topic. So it's really the aim of our session today. Why is the topic important for the Council of Europe? We're a human rights organization, rule of law, also democracy, but for the human rights aspect, non-discrimination, we have a specific unit working on LGBT rights. In the transversal activities we perform, we touch upon this topic in our internet governance strategy, for instance. In the field of data protection specifically, I recall that it's personal information regarding sexual orientation, sexual information is sensitive data. So to link it to the previous panel, for instance, you would require explicit consent. You need a stronger protection for that type of personal information and its processing. One of the main highlights of a recent campaign that the Council of Europe has been delivering is the No Hate Speech campaign, so no hate speech online. And there were some activities specifically focusing on the question of LGBT and their rights. I would like just briefly to mention the fact that while our general hate speech definition doesn't expressly refer to homophobia or the topic, we also have a text at the Council of Europe that dates back from 2010, which is a specific text on measures to combat discrimination on grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity, where specifically there is a reference to hate speech as being forms of expression, including the media and on the internet, which may be reasonably understood as likely to produce the effect of inciting, spreading, or promoting hatred or other forms of discrimination against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons. So this is also one topic that has been covered by activities implemented under this campaign, and so I really wanted to make the link with the campaign today. I mentioned the right to privacy, to data protection, right to anonymity. Those are all the rights, and if I may just underline, data protection and right to anonymity are both rights which are enabling rights. They don't only serve the right to privacy, but they also serve freedom of expression, freedom of association, and this is really key for this topic too. Maybe not in our European countries, but in other parts of the world, we see that there is even the right to life, which is at threat for LGBT+ in a digital environment. So there is a lot to say on the topic and a lot to do. We have the chance today to have great panelists on our table. They will discuss, I'm sure, with expertise and passion the topic. So let me first introduce you to Monika Zalnieriute. She will be our moderator for the session. Monika has a number of hats on. researcher, activist, Council of Europe expert. I know she will be mentioning some of the work she has been doing for the Council of Europe. Our speaker is to my right, Lara Ballard. She's from the US State Department, but today speaking in her capacity of former captain of the US Army, the Air Defense Artillery in the 90s. You will be speaking about that. Further right, we have Renato Sabbadini, who's the executive director of the association ILGA. And Renato, you've also been an activist in the field for over 20 years now, so you have a good take on the problems. Ben Wagner, on my left far. Ben is a researcher and director of the Center for Internet and Human Rights. And finally, apologies, we were supposed to have Valentina Pellizer from APC. She could not make it. And the other thing I also wanted to point out is that we really tried to get on board a private sector representative. We tried hard, and I thought actually it would be easier to get a private sector representative, industry representative, speaking about the topic, because they have been doing some good things. So normally when we reach out to them for other topics, they are not as willing. Unfortunately, we could not make it to have one here today. So I now leave the session to Monika to moderate it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I think Sophie said a lot already, and I just say once again that this panel is part of our larger effort to initiate the debate and dialogue to set up the research and policy agenda on LGBT and digital rights, so we can fight the digital inequality of LGBT communities. I don't want to speak a lot, but since this topic, I guess, is sort of new for the audience here, I just briefly set the floor before giving a word to the panelists, and it's not going to be long. All I wanted to say that people all over the world use the internet and enjoy their human rights, the digital rights, or I think it varies how much they enjoy of that, but and in that sense, our topic of today is not revolutionary at all, because the idea that the idea that digital and internet rights apply equally to LGBT communities just as any other person in the world is not revolutionary or puzzling. It simply rests on the principle of equality and non-discrimination. But where we are, and internet brings a lot of good things for LGBT communities. They have new ways to connect and exchange information and liaise together, but at the same time, the internet is increasingly being used to restrict the exercise of their fundamental rights. And I don't want to say a lot. You can also have a look at the slide, but it's a lot of different things, from blanket bans on internet filtering of LGBT-related content in many countries, including the US. And for example, any library in the US that wants to have federal funding needs to install the filters that would filter out anything to do with LGBT-related content. And it goes so broadly that, for example, a person in the library can no longer search even for the breast cancer, because the word breast is also somehow considered indecent. And it goes really far and leaves us with a problem that the very same people that need the help most, they don't have access to information, simply because we have these policies in place that try to protect children from harmful information, and that apparently includes information about people like myself. So the exercise of digital rights for LGBT communities are pretty much a daily struggle. And the problem is threefold. I don't want to talk a lot, but the idea is that LGBT communities don't have access to digital rights. There is no participation in policy making, so we're really underrepresented. And understanding of the problems and the relationship between LGBT and technology at the intersection that is there is very limited and pretty much non-existent, because we have no resources and no research. So this really dictates a triple agenda that is needed, and I will quickly just show you that research is needed to understand the problem, so then we can increase the participation and finally we can change certain policies, which our panelists now will probably talk in more detail, and I will not hold you any further. So we will have 3 interesting talks, and first I would like to invite Lara from the US State Department and the former captain of the US military to speak about the US military and LGBT community between 1941 and 2011 and beyond. So Lara, I'll give you the floor now. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, and I really appreciate the effort and thought that, that Monika and Sophie have taken to put this together. And yes, we did try very hard to get an industry representative, and there was interest. It just never turned out to be interest among people who could be in Brussels for this event on this date. On the topic of privacy, which is really my main area, and LGBT individuals, I'm going to put out there that there's a statement I always hear, and it irritates me. This is just my pet peeve. A lot of what I say is actually an official position, but you know, I'm confident President Obama would back me up on this. But I always hear this statement that sexual orientation is a very sensitive and a private matter. And what bothers me about that is that, to my experience, it's not a sensitive matter as long as you're heterosexual. So if I say to you, my husband is home watching my child while I'm here this week in Brussels, people just say, oh, that's nice. If I say my wife is home watching my daughter while I'm here this week in Brussels, which is the truth, suddenly I've become an activist or provocateur. I have some sort of agenda. It's, in terms of privacy and disclosure, it's exactly the same disclosure of data in both instances. In neither instances am I making inappropriate comments in a forum about sex life, and yet it's talked about as sensitive. So I am going to talk about LGBT people in the U.S. military, and what you should know is that there was a policy that excluded gays, lesbians, and bisexuals from open service that started in 1941, and it ended in 2011 with the repeal of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell statute, which President Obama signed into law. So what we're talking about here is a relic of history, but it's an interesting history. According to the Urban Institute, there are about 1 million gay or lesbian Americans who have served in the US military, and the Urban Institute had a methodology they came up with based on collating 2 different kinds of data out of the US Census. I'm sure they're interested in transgender populations as well, they just haven't figured out how to calculate that yet. And so the origin of this policy really comes about at the outbreak of World War II, or our entry into World War II, which began with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And it happened because 2 things happened at the same time. The first was that the medical community at that time had decided that same-sex sexual activity was being unfairly treated as a crime. And this was because they discovered that there were certain people that just had a predilection or a natural orientation towards people of the same sex. And so they turned it from a crime into a mental illness. And they saw this as a form of progress. Now, what's so interesting about that, for those of us privacy scholars who, most of us have at some point read Michel Foucault's deconstruction of Bentham's panopticon prison, is that the panopticon prison is also intended to be a type of progress. It's a progress from old ideas about punishment that involve corporal punishment, punishment of the body, to discipline and control of the mind. And so, yes. Oh, okay. You look at you were about to, I can't be 10 minutes yet. And so this had that same effect. And the reason the panopticon prison is so efficient is that it effectively outsources surveillance to those being surveilled. Those in a panopticon prison can't see if there's anyone in the watchtower or not, so they have to assume someone could be watching at any time, and they modify their behavior accordingly. And so the pathologization of homosexuality created this generation of people who would, on their own volition, realize that they were having these supposedly unnatural feelings and would go seek out medical advice. So that's one thing going on. The other thing that happens after the attack on Pearl Harbor is simply a massive influx of military draftees into the US military. And today it's really hard for us to remember a time when the US military was both small and ill-regarded. But there was a time in the 1930s where if there were bars with signs in the windows that said no soldiers or dogs allowed. So to a degree, Americans didn't really care whether homosexual activity went on in the military. But suddenly they did, because all of their sons were in this military body. And so this influx of draftees dovetails with this pathologization of homosexuality, and it creates a system where they have to find and root out all the homosexuals before they infect the healthy ones. And so if you've ever wondered why it is that San Francisco is a gay city, it's because in World War II, San Francisco was a major out-processing point for these sorts of discharges. So you had just men streaming out of the out-processing center with homosexuality on their papers, and they couldn't go home, but then there were these friendly guys who owned a cafe, and it built like an immigrant community. The other thing that's really interesting about gays in the military is that the military, by and large, throws privacy out the window. It is a very privacy-invasive environment. By necessity. I mean, some of it comes from the need to ensure operational security. This is why your mail is surveilled and censored, because you can't just write to your spouse and say, well, my unit is secretly moving to Kandahar tomorrow and I'm really nervous about that. So a lot of people just accept and find humor in this facet of military life. I was commissioned as an officer, which in the US system you can't do unless you have a university degree. So I had a university degree from Georgetown University. I showed up at my unit in 1992, and they greeted me with great excitement because I was their first female military officer, and they needed a female officer to watch the women pee. So there was mandatory urinalysis. And when you do urinalysis, you have to actually watch the person pee so that they're not sneaking someone else's urine into the cup. So this was one of my first functions as a commissioned officer, was watching people pee, putting my university degree to work. And again, even gay people themselves find these situations just sort of funny. And the climate, the work climate, is one where people are very inquisitive about your personal life. And they genuinely care whether you've had sex lately because you seem really tense and anxious at work. And they know a really nice guy who, would really like to go out with you. So you can't even describe this as mass surveillance. I mean, it's a system that everyone seems to enjoy, or at least respect or buy into. And they enjoyed this aspect of military life. And so the problem came in when all of this privacy invasive lifestyle and these practices were then targeted at sexual orientation. And I can tell you one story. This actually comes out of a book by Randy Schultz. It's called The Conduct Unbecoming. And apparently I can't tell you what countries those are, but if you're really curious, go look in the book. So in 1985, a US Air Force sergeant was stationed to an air base here in Europe. And he fell in love with a European man. They moved in together. And one day, the European man, his name was Albert. This guy's name was Jack Green. His partner was Albert. Albert borrowed his car. And the European police stopped him and said, why are you driving this American's car, which incidentally exempts you from having to pay road taxes? And so he conferred with an attorney, and he said, well, the truth of the matter is, I'm married to a member of the US military, but please don't tell the US military. A week later, that European country's military police show up and search their residence and say, we're doing this at the request of the US authorities. And they take an awful lot of interest in the bedroom. After that, this sergeant, his name was Jack Green, finds himself under investigation. Then he's not under investigation because the Dutch have intervened. Oh no, now I blew it. It's in the book, okay. So, then he's put on desk duty and they won't give him anything to do. He becomes suicidal. He's in and out of psychiatric facilities. He ends up actually sneaking across the border into this unnamed European country. And apparently, I think, lives happily ever after. But, the thing is, this is the conundrum, is that a lot of these methods of gathering and asking for personal information are perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with inquiring about why a European is driving a car with US Army, or Air Force military plates. There's nothing wrong with making sure that this is a legitimate relationship. And yet, this sort of mechanism can so easily be misdirected that you know, I'm really left with more questions and answers about what is the nexus between LGBT and privacy. But I can tell you that from the standpoint of those of us who fought to end Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and were in that room when Obama finally repealed the law, none of us were really trying to change these essential facets of military life. People were against Don't Ask, Don't Tell because they really believed in the military and wanted to be a part of that. And so for us, this was never an issue of privacy. It was actually quite the opposite. We were saying that what we had to share were facts as simple as my wife is home watching my child while I'm in Brussels. And so for us, this was not an issue of privacy. This was an issue of equality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara. Before we go to other panelists, would there maybe audience would like to ask a question, because this is a very good chance to do that now. Would there be anyone? No. Yeah. So okay, we can leave it for later. So then we would like to invite Renato Sabbadini to speak. He's executive director of ILGA International and would like to share the insights from a different perspective, I guess, rather than we are the privacy community, and he represents the LGBT movement and would like to share his perceptions with us. So thank you. Renato, you go ahead.
Thank you very much, Monika, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me and having me here. I think that it's important to begin with a caveat, in the sense that what I will be saying is not so much an official position taken by ILGA, but rather the result of personal observation and conversations with fellow colleagues and fellow activists. The reason for this is neither by choice or by accident. The fact is that within the LGBTI movement, and particularly in articulated organizations like ILGA, the issue of digital rights has not been very much discussed. There is indeed quite a need to bring us up to speed on the subject. In reality, okay, let's say there are discussions about digital rights, but they're almost exclusively focused on those countries of the global south and east where authorities persecute LGBTI people, especially if they are activists. Whereas the risk of the loss of digital rights in the global north and west seems of much lesser import, particularly among Western LGBTI activists, and even more among, let's say, Western average members of the LGBTI community. And to insist on this subject may provoke condescending smiles, as if in the presence of someone clearly exaggerating the scope of a risk. It is not too difficult to understand why this should be the case, especially in Western Europe and in North America. After decades of struggle and at the first concrete signs of genuine equality, the dominant feeling is of gratitude towards the public institutions which sanctioned the social and cultural changes, turning the most unspeakable and shameful of human orientations into something almost universally accepted and even banal in certain contexts. The idea that those very public institutions might be contributing or allowing the construction of a totalitarian system or a para-totalitarian system is too disturbing to be entertained. No one likes to spoil a party, especially where people are there to celebrate a victory. On the same, in a similar way of reasoning, leads many of those who are reaping the fruits of decades of struggle in Western Europe and North America, leads them to the idea that any complaining on our side, meaning the Western side, should simply pale and fall silent when confronted with the harsh reality that still too many lesbians and gays and gender non-conform people have to face in more than a third of the world's countries. And indeed, there's no way of deceiving us about this. Life can be very complicated and risky where old prejudices meet new technologies. At the very least, you may find serious obstacles in accessing the information you need to break out of your social isolation. If you live in Indonesia, for instance, you won't be able to access my organization's website, courtesy of the Indonesian government. But things can easily be much worse. You may, for instance, access a website like ILGA's, but at your own peril, assuming that you can access it from home, that you don't have to go into a crowded internet cafe with people behind your back all the time, able to see what you see. The peril may come in the form of government spies tracing your browsing history and later using it against you and whomever you are in contact with, especially if the laws of the country criminalize same-sex sexual activities among consenting adults. Which is why, for instance, ILGA, we in ILGA at our regional conferences organize workshops to train LGBTI human rights defenders to protect their laptops and computers from this kind of intrusive activities. Maybe it would be a good idea to introduce this kind of trainings also in regional conferences taking place in the West. And it may become clearer later. But the peril may also come, as in Egypt, in the form of government agents, police agents, pretending to be online what they are not. It has, for instance, young men looking for company who will set you up and arrest you when the moment is ripe. In many countries of the global south and east, anonymity on the internet can indeed be a question of life and death. This current and very apparent contrast between countries with progressive legislation and countries actively persecuting LGBTI people, especially activists, leads many to believe, both in the north and in the south, that once the government, that the government is the problem, that the hostile government is the problem, and that once a government has nothing against your sexual orientation and gender identity, no harm can come from the loss of privacy. The assumption being that while a government is very powerful and resourceful by definition, one can usually find a relatively easy way of protecting oneself from the snooping regard of acquaintances, schoolmates, spouses, or parents, because they're a smaller reality, it's easier to control. And in a way, I have sometimes the feeling that we are, particularly in the West, like Joseph K. in Kafka's trial, happy to undergo the scrutiny of the law, provided no one who knows us knows about this proceeding. We are developing this sort of bourgeois feeling of being happy to undergo a trial as long as it's discreet and hidden. In essence, the need for online anonymity emerges only when faced by a hostile government. There are those who go even further and argue that in a society in which no one had to hide anything about themselves, no one would ever have to fear any reprimand or blackmail by anyone. There were two interesting examples of this point of reasoning in Italy a few years ago. The first one is when the married governor of the region Lazio was found by the Carabinieri with a trans sex worker and was after forced to resign. Many on the left argued that the problem was not that his privacy had been intruded, but that the visit to a sex worker should not represent a problem. In a similar way, when the Home Minister during the Berlusconi's era proposed to take the fingerprint of all Roma, the most progressive voices of Italian society proposed instead, and they were dead serious about it, to take the fingerprints of the whole population in a sort of prefiguration of the NSA's collect it all principle and on a voluntary basis. The question is, of course, whether or not this nothing to hide, nothing to fear attitude is really warranted, and most importantly, whether living in such a society would be worth it. At the very least, we can say that the belief of having nothing to fear with a good, friendly government has a very weak basis. Governments change all the time, and you may easily live long enough to regret the moment when you relinquish control over your private life to a good government, recently replaced by a very bad one. But there is also a deeper sense in which no government can be seen as inherently good from this point of view, in relation to the private lives of its citizens. Governments and people are two different kinds of entities, like bodies and cells. The interest of the former may easily not coincide with those of the latter, especially if we're dealing with one or few of the latter. If you're a body, you want your cells to be predictable, hence conform. And this maybe relates a little bit to the fact that Lara was mentioning earlier on, that in the military life, it's a granted, it's a given that privacy is somehow the price to pay for belonging to it. There is an important lesson which I'm afraid many LGBTI activists are forgetting, and it's the lesson coming from an Italian philosopher of law, Norberto Bobbio, who pointed out, for instance, that the reason a constitution needs to protect, time is up almost, to protect its citizens from the snooping regard of the government is because whoever detains power tends to abuse of it. There is also another important warning by US philosopher Daniel Dennett that we cannot ignore, and that if we ignore at our peril. And that is that if we are to preserve the only variety of free will worth wanting, we need to retain our unpredictability towards others. We must not reveal all of ourselves, or we will cease to be unpredictable and thus free. I'm afraid that at the moment we are revealing a lot about ourselves in schizophrenic bouts online, of narcissism and feelings of self-worthlessness. Like a lot of, you will hear this a lot from LGBTI activists like anywhere else. I don't care, I'm not interesting enough for the government or anyone to spy on me. And thus we are revealing a lot and allowing government or corporations to collect it all and have algorithms predict our next move on the basis of our likes. To conclude, it is quite worrisome that the right to privacy, which is at the basis of the struggle of homosexuals and transgendered persons at the beginnings of the movement in the West, is considered superfluous. And certainly this attitude is not limited only to LGBTI people, it's unfortunately very general. But from this point of view, it is sad to see that at least we LGBTI are truly equal to everyone else. We risk all sleepwalking into dystopia, closer to Brave New World perhaps than 1984, but more pervasive than Huxley or Orwell would have ever dared to imagine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renato, for sharing your insights with us. And I guess we could move on to Ben, and then we will have some time left for discussion and questions from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you both to Monika and Sophie for organizing this, and also to the people in the room who are here, who are not quite as many as in the last panel, but still quite a few people. So, because I can see lots of faces in blue screens in the beautiful reflection that is the computer screen, I'd like to start with something simple. If the people in the room are awake, could you please raise your hand if you use Spotify or another online music service which has playlists? Please raise your hands. That's about, and the panelists as well, 70% of the room. Recent research studies show that with over 90% accuracy, it's possible to tell the sexual preference of an individual based on their online playlists. So, if you have online playlists, there is an algorithm somewhere in the world that can tell you what your sexual preferences are in an automated fashion. Just to get us started, that you know what's going on and what we're talking about here. So my name is Ben Wagner. I run a research center in Berlin called the Center for Internet and Human Rights, and I work closely with Monika and other people in this area who are working on these issues because we think it's an important area that hasn't yet been covered enough and where there haven't been enough debates on this issue. Digital rights, human rights, and the internet, what are we talking about? I think in many cases it's fair to say that we have a lot of debates in this community about technology. And I'd like to proffer the suggestion that at least for this panel and for the next 30, 40 minutes, the internet is not about technology. It has absolutely nothing to do with technology. It has a lot to do with human beings, about relationships between individuals that construct things that they care about, but also just interface, connect, discuss. And even doing that when I'm talking about the internet, I have to use technical words which are completely inappropriate. They talk to each other and they happen to use technology in the way to do so. And that technology seems to be predominant. As a result of that, we end up talking about these technologies, but we actually don't talk about the people behind it. And that's a challenge because when you're talking about harms that are created through the internet, challenges, problems, issues, biases, discrimination, we don't talk about the human beings. We talk about the technologies that were censored, the privacy that was stopped, the invasion into our freedoms that was created. But somehow the people behind it are masked and hidden. And I think that constitutes a problem for many, many areas. And there are many groups that are affected by that, and they're excluded from having agency in all sorts of different ways. But it's specifically a case with LGBT communities, simply because there's so little debate about it that it's painful to acknowledge that we even have to have this panel to start a research agenda on these issues, that we even have to have this conversation. I'm slightly embarrassed that we have to do it, but we still have to do it, and the fact that there are at least some people in this room suggests that there might be a reasonable reason to at least attempt to try to do it. So the solutions then to all of these problems are equally strange and equally weird. You're censored? No problem. You're disconnected. We'll just reconnect you. We'll give you a proxy server so you can get around the disconnection. Your privacy is invaded. Don't worry about it. We'll give you better encryption. We'll give you better privacy tools, and then everything will be fine. Dealing with the fact that in a basic situation, a better privacy tool will not prevent you from having come out once you've come out, or from preventing you having your sexual identity, which, as you know, is already on your music playlist, so you don't need to worry about that. It's already known, at least to some automated algorithms which are running over your playlists. There's not a choice that you can make that will necessarily have a technological solution because it's not about technology, it's about human beings. And of course, technology influences this and is strange to this. And as we've heard already, Renato was mentioning, I think it's extremely important. Privacy is in many ways a basis of some of the rights around which the early LGBT movement sort of formed and developed. But it goes into so many different areas that we've now forgotten this and pretend like it's our right or it's our privacy and it's our issues, and that other communities shouldn't be thinking or caring about it. The same goes for the issue that Monika was mentioning about libraries. It's not just libraries. When you speak to private companies around the world, when they are censored, when governments ask them to take content down, in vast majority, or vast majority is a little bit much, but in many, many cases, in many, many situations, they're talking about LGBT content. They're not talking about this content or that content. It's actual LGBT content that is being taken down. And for obvious reasons, or perhaps less obvious reasons, but for obvious reasons to them, they then don't talk about it and they refuse to talk about other issues. Why is that happening? I think it's similar to the issues we've discussed already. It's much easier to say, I'm a champion of speech rights, because everybody understands freedom of speech. You don't need to pretend for some reason that you might have some kind of other preference. It's exactly the same story that Lara was sharing, just in a slightly different context. If you're sharing information about your partner, then it's fine, but as long as it's heterosexual. And so if we're sharing stories about censorship, why are we sharing them about stories about censorship and freedom of expression, rather than stories about the story behind it? Who is being censored? Why are they being censored? And why is the information about them being filtered out? And I think the reason is that it's harder to promote, at least in perception of human beings, LGBT rights than speech rights. People feel more comfortable, it's easier, it's easier to say, to suggest, and I think that's a problem that as a community and as a wider group of human beings we need to tackle if we're going to break out of this wonderfully formulated panopticon prison that we're still stuck in. There's no obvious way to do that in an immediate, small sense. There's a lot of work involved of the different people who are in this room. But I think the first and most obvious point is to empower people who are affected by this to be part of the process of understanding. That's to say, to make sure that the people who are affected by this, who are involved in this, to be part of the process of research, to be also part of the process of advocacy. And that raises all sorts of challenges and questions, but they need to be in the room and they need to be part of that conversation. Otherwise, we shouldn't even be having it. And this then also involves linking this community. I hope there are at least some people from consider themselves to be the digital rights community, to different LGBT organizations who are working on these issues. There have been some fantastic, I think some people in this room have even been to them, some wonderful seminars on workshops on gender and technology. We need the same things on LGBT and technology. And they haven't even begun to get started because those communities don't know each other, as we've just heard. They don't know who to talk to. They don't know who to reach out to when we have a problem. And so there's issues there, there's things related to that. And then when you move down to, again, the fundamental question, it's about human beings, not about technologies. Then the question is, once you've empowered those individuals and once you've put them in a position to conduct research and to understand these issues better, how do you link that to advocacy? How do you ensure that they can not only make their voice heard, but have impact with that? And it's a very big challenge because when you're thinking about how that develops and what issues are related to that, it's not just that you could assume, we've heard that many of these technologies are developed in Silicon Valley, and Silicon Valley is a historically LGBT community. That doesn't necessarily mean that the technologies are without bias. And we know that a large amount of decisions that we make in our everyday lives are based on algorithmic decision-making by computers. And it's very unreasonable to assume that those decisions would be made any differently than the base decisions that are made by the societies under them. That means if the society has discrimination, we're likely to see discrimination in algorithms. And this is specifically a case for the many forms of automated decision-making that are increasingly rampant in healthcare, in online services, and as we're hearing about related to all sorts of areas of the military as well. As algorithms become more prevalent, we need to ensure that people have ways to access information and transparently ensure that they understand what decisions are being made against them and about them, how are they being discriminated against, and what ways do they have, what agency do they have in responding to that. That's an extremely challenging question. I don't have answers to any of the questions I've raised, to be perfectly honest, but I hope that together with the people in this room and together with the wider community of people that I feel part of working in some way related to internet and human rights, but also working on LGBT rights, we can collectively find ways to solve this, because at this point we have a lot more questions than answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben and all the panelists. Before we move on to the audience, maybe Sophie would like to say something, or shall we? Okay. So if anybody would have questions, and please ask, and we can start the discussion, and then maybe we'll see where it goes from there. Yeah. Is there anybody bringing a microphone? Yeah, please go ahead.
So generally you've talked about the countries where, you know, there's people fearing for their lives, and then countries in the West as a separate situation. But it's become very clear that there are certain agents in the West who have a clear interest in influencing and pushing a homophobic agenda in various parts of the world, whether that's Africa, Russia, wherever. What is there that we can do about that? And also, what is there we can do about the fact that our governments are, in many cases, propping up and supporting regimes or systems in other countries which are not only persecuting gays but killing them, whether that's Saudi Arabia or other similar countries which are being supported by the UK, the US, and so on, and then using the tools that we give them to surveil their population to then discriminate against the LGBT community.
Is there any particular panelist you would...
I'd certainly be interested in Lara's response to that, and also maybe Ben's.
I think, yeah, Lara definitely, and Ben works on trying to sort of stop the export of surveillance technologies to these countries, so he can definitely comment, and then we can move on to the next question. Maybe Lara, would you like to comment on this?
Sure. I mean, this isn't my particular area of expertise. I know that the State Department does do human rights work and promotes tolerance and equality for LGBT people. And it's also worth pointing out, a little bit going back to the gays in the military issue, that on 2 instances during the years of the gay exclusion policy, someone was brutally murdered by their fellow military service members because they perceived him to be gay. One was Alan Schindler, one was Barry Winchell. So there does seem to be at least an attenuated connection between an ideology or an official policy that effectively positions someone as a second-class citizen or subhuman, where even though that's not intended to have a violent result, somebody will take that ideology a step further and turn it into a violent act. But, you know, foreign cultures can't be changed by remote control. You can promote your beliefs, but you know, believe it or not, the United States is not actually in control of everything, or even most things, even if we know a lot about it. You know, I did want to add one other point about gays in the military, because I was in the early 90s. And the perception I have is that the internet was actually, on the whole, hugely empowering to that particular community. So by the time I left, I was stationed in Germany, we were just getting email. And I came back home to America in the middle of this .com boom. And I just hadn't heard of this, like people surf around websites and whatnot. But I think it really helped service members who are in incredibly hostile and sometimes life-threatening situation find out that there was, for example, the Service Members Legal Defense Network, a legal aid organization. And so they could download an entire legal guide to surviving under this policy without having to take the risk of asking around about it at work or seeing if any friends have heard about it. So you know, the internet still has that empowering quality, even if at the same time people may be doing something online that endangers them. They could also be doing something offline that endangers them even more.
It's a very fair point, and just to follow up on that, I think it would be easy to sort of provide a short answer with, well, you just stop the countries getting blurred. And that I think it's more complicated than that. I think there's a danger, as was mentioned here on this panel already, to fall into this trap of good countries and bad countries. And I think there's more that there's challenges on these issues for probably every country and every company in the world. And I don't have a direct answer to that. We can prevent the sort of the flow of surveillance technologies or try and make people more responsible for misusing them, but that's just part of the challenge. I think the bigger challenge is developing a base of understanding, and in this sense, really knowledge is power because there is so little knowledge out there. And with that basis of understanding to then advocate and lobby for less discrimination, more access to information, and also more understanding among the people who are developing these processes and systems of why this is an important issue, and why the fact that certain technologies providing even your playlists on the internet may not be a good idea if those have certain consequences.
There was another person willing to ask another question. Yeah? Go ahead, please. There too, okay.
Hello, it's Tim Edgar, Brown University. First of all, Lara, thank you very much for your service. I guess my question goes to this issue that Lara raised about the military culture being one which lacks privacy in many basic fundamental ways. And it strikes me that a lot of the other panels around this conference, and it's sort of become you know, almost a cliche as we talk about just how little privacy we have online for commercial reasons, for government surveillance, for a variety of reasons, that in a sense all of us are living you know, digitally in that panopticon environment that offline maybe we aren't. And so in a way that impacts this issue. And my question really has to do with I guess the relationship between these two fundamental human rights, the human right of privacy and then the human right of equality for regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity, and the fact that the problematic part of it, or the difficulty in a way, is that for people living in that very hostile environment, privacy becomes this extraordinarily valuable and desperately needed a fundamental right, precisely because it isn't, it's sort of this one-sided privacy. You know, it's privacy not about sexual orientation, it's privacy about the fact that somebody is gay. You know, if they're straight, they don't need to worry about that privacy. And so it seems to me that privacy almost becomes part of the stigmatization. And the process that Lara described in terms of gays in the military was really a description about how, in order to kind of deal with the issues of equality, you had to allow people to choose to reveal information that they were essentially being forced not to reveal. And so I was wondering if people could sort of comment on that issue of how do you address how do you address how privacy needs change based on the level of hostility in the particular society that we're talking about, where privacy about one particular fact actually becomes a way of stigmatizing people, or it can be a way of stigmatizing people rather than a way of empowering them to choose to keep certain information private or not.
Who would like to take on this? Was the question how the privacy needs to change? Or, okay. Somebody would like to, I hardly can.
Do you want to go first? Or?
No, you go first.
Okay. Well, your question raises, reminds me of an interesting article that was written recently in Slate.com by Alvaro Bedoya, who's now teaching at Georgetown Law School. And, on the one hand, I actually gave him some helpful information about sort of the inappropriate privacy invasions that had occurred in a few instances in gays in the military, particularly where a gay person told a psychologist in a clinical setting that I'm feeling gay, and this person disclosed it. So there were a few isolated instances where this legal aid organization, Service Members Legal Defense Network, did intervene as to the information collection method itself and just said that this is inappropriate. At the same time, if you went to an Army psychologist and said, I'm feeling either homicidal or suicidal, they would probably disclose that to the chain of command before somebody puts a loaded weapon in that person's hands. So even there, it's not that people objected to the practice overall. But Alvaro Bedoya raises an interesting argument, which is that sometimes societal values are lagging perhaps several decades behind our capacity to surveil for them. So, 20 or 30 years ago, or even just a few years ago, people justified the don't ask, don't tell policy and the gay exclusion policy and said, well, this isn't discriminatory. It's just a fact that, these people will disrupt unit cohesion and morale. And so it's only been in a few short years that suddenly America has just completely turned around on same-sex marriage. And so, to know this and to know what it was like just a few years ago when we were all miscreants and mentally ill and trying to corrupt your children, it makes me wonder who we're oppressing now, where 30 years from now we're all going to feel really guilty and realize that that was a really wrong thing to do. So it does cause somewhat of a dilemma. And, I think for that reason you can't just toss the privacy issue out the window and say this is an issue of equality, because I'm sure we're oppressing someone else by now and I just don't know who it is.
The last point made by Lara is actually excellent, because it's the real heart of the matter. We cannot, we must resist the temptation that at times we might have, that we are basically living almost at the end of history. And I've heard sometimes even some fellow activists saying this, that basically LGBTI is the last wall of discrimination. Once that will fall, basically we will live in a harmonious society in which nobody is discriminated against on any basis. The fact is that you don't know who we are oppressing. Well, I have a few suspicions as to whom we might be oppressing now, but I mean, that is the fact. Human societies evolve, and there is always one wonders if there is a perverse dynamics in societies where somehow some scapegoating is always necessary, and so whenever at some point you relieve a group, a social group from the category of scapegoats, that you need to replace it with someone else. So indeed, privacy is still should be an important weapon when looking towards the future.
Thanks. I think we had another question from that. Yes, please go ahead. Many more.
Does that work? Yeah. Hello, my name is Judith Rauhofer. I'm from the University of Edinburgh. I would like to take something that Lara said and connect it to something that Renato said before. Lara said before that the internet is not just about, all the bad things that can happen. It is also about actually giving people, and I'm particularly thinking of children and teenagers in this context, giving them the ability to participate. I'm currently doing some research around fan fiction, which takes me into some really weird fandoms. Lots of 14-year-old girls, lots of, beautiful gay boys. And what I found out about that really was how important the internet was for them, both to find out information and to build communities. And I would like to, the privacy aspect, because, when I do that kind of research, I always have this meta text in my head about where's the privacy, where's the privacy. So the privacy aspect that occurred to me on this one is, of course, that so many of them are coming up against these real name policies that we're now finding. And this is what I wanted to take up from you, the anonymity issue, okay? We are not just looking, I think, in research at the internet about all the bad things that can happen. And I agree, when Grindr first came on stream, I was just like, why would I want to stay, in the middle of East London with a rainbow beacon over my head just flashing? That's just not safe. That's just not something I would want to do. Why would I voluntarily, effectively enter my name into a gay database, when in 10 years' time we could have a different government and that could actually access that database and just do something to me and stuff. So there is all this negative stuff out there. But don't you think that we also need to focus on the positive things? The way in which my girlfriend does online support of LGBT teenagers in Scotland, and they're doing this via an online chat line. And these are teenagers that live in the, in the Highlands and the islands where there is no actual on-the-ground support, and they can't speak to their parents. And we're still in that situation where they can't speak to their parents, and where they have issues coming out, and where they have questions, and the information isn't available. And from that point of view, I think the privacy aspect that we need to have is that these people need the agency and the autonomy to move in those spaces without being afraid that their privacy is compromised. And I think this is the issue where we have a very clear line with regard to other privacy research that we're doing, with regard to anonymity rights, pseudonymity rights, against real name policies, all of that sort of stuff. And I think that, I'm not sure if anybody would be interested in going into that sort of direction, because I think that is very, very important at the moment.
Thank you so much for your comment. And indeed, you're totally right. The digital rights, I think, first of all, concerns the access to information. And I think it's really, really important for us to therefore bring this up and bring this out of the closet, if we shall even use the jargon of LGBT communities. But I wanted to say briefly that it's not only about privacy. It's digital rights relate to LGBT communities in many different ways, and they are relevant in much more many ways, and rather than just privacy. I would like to give one example before we continue with the questions, is with Council of Europe, as Sophie mentioned, we work on human rights issues as they relate to ICANN, which is this non-profit corporation based in California, which is responsible for the technical management of internet domain names. So I would just like to bring in a small technical aspect, for example, on how this relates to freedom of expression and LGBT rights. For example, how we should govern and the issue whether somebody should be allowed to register a .gay domain, or for example, whether somebody should be allowed to register homosexuality is a sin.org. I can tell you immediately that nobody is allowed to register googlesucks.com, because trademark holders would insist that this is too confusingly similar to the trademark. Then, for example, why somebody is allowed to register being gay is a sin.org. The point that I'm trying to make is that it's a complex issue where freedom of expression intersects with LGBT rights. And very interesting point that the data at the moment is revealing is that, for example, whereas in many countries the LGBT-related content websites would be blocked, comparable anti-LGBT websites, and let's say the example that I gave with the domain name homosexualityisasin.org, I just made it up, but that wouldn't be blocked. The question is why? It still has the same words that should be blocked. And so these are the things that I am at the moment contemplating on the freedom of expression as it relates to digital rights too. And thank you for pointing this out, and especially the important work that people are doing and creating these digital channels for those in the very need to be able to connect with the community. And before, we can have another question, I think, to keep it on rolling. Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so we also had interesting experiences with the military anti-gay policies with anonymity and online anonymity. And to my experience, it often did work. I mean, I had a friend who was an active duty Army major named Alan Rogers, and he was a member of our gay veterans organization, and he maintained an email address called Tegugai, and managed to maintain his confidentiality until he was killed in combat in Iraq. And now there was a lot of press about him. There's a very good profile of him in the New Yorker. But there was another notorious case called the Tim McVeigh case, not to be confused with the Oklahoma City bomber. This guy was a non-commissioned officer in the Navy, and he was, I don't remember all the details, but he was having some sort of gay chat. He had a pseudonym. And so he was doing something completely within the rules of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because the rules were don't tell anyone in your unit. And somehow this became a topic of investigation, I think in violation of investigative guidelines. And AOL gave the military the name of this account holder. And at that point, I mean, there was a court suit, and even the architect of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, a sociologist named Charles Moskos, said this is not how Don't Ask, Don't Tell was supposed to work. But what we found is that these instances of anonymity being breached, psychologists turning people in, told us that this sort of nonsense doesn't stop until we address the underlying discrimination. Because in each instance, they would say, oh yes, you're right, the investigators violated their investigative guidelines, but now that we know he's gay, he still has to go. So that's where we went about that. You mentioned something. Yeah.
Yes. Just before we finish, we would like to comment on one thing that we read on Twitter here. One commenter was saying that no speaker can convince them that U.S. military cares about LGBT people, about the selective care, and mentioned Chelsea Manning. So maybe Lara can briefly comment so we take at least one question from the digital audience.
Okay, well, I can't give you an official position on Chelsea Manning. I can tell you that I have a lot of friends who are transgender veterans, and they have rallied around the point that the military does not pay for gender reassignment surgery. And so to them, this is an issue of humane treatment of someone in a military prison. They say she has gender identity disorder. If you can't treat it in that prison, then move her to a civilian prison. But as to the underlying offenses that got her into prison, I find that the transgender veterans have absolutely no tolerance for what she did. I mean, they just feel that that is anathema to their values. Because again, people who have joined the military tend to genuinely believe in its ideals. So, as to, like I said, there are these rules, these burdensome rules that you live under when you're in the military, and most people in the military really respect that. So I think they have a lot of sympathy and pity for her in her current circumstances.
Thank you so much. I think there was one more person willing to ask a question. Oh, I see. Okay, please, over there.
Thank you. I am Eero Vals. I'm a PhD student at the University of Leuven. So basically, I mean, my research is about the analysis and design of privacy technologies. When I think about the gay community or the LGBT community, and I think about designing technologies to actually protect their privacy, I don't see any, or maybe I fail to see what are the particularities of the LGBT community with respect to developing tools for actually like censorship resistance or anonymity. So my question would be, what are the particularities of this specific minority or collective?
Yeah, please, can we have another question in, and then we will quickly wrap up the thing.
Thanks. Stephanie Perrin, University of Toronto. My question is about the big data problem. And I really appreciate Renato's remark about unpredictability. One of the things that drives me crazy about big data is the certainty of the sellers of profiles. So when in fact,
speak loudly.
Thank you so much for the questions. I think Renato could take the first one. What are the particularities of this particular community, LGBT community, what they are? Maybe Renato can
briefly address both.
Definitely.
Well, the particularity is the fact, of course, that as I said, there is from a legislative point of view around the world, there are such huge differences, there are very important differences between different parts of the world. But as such, in essence, there is nothing specific about the LGBTI community which would make it different from many other minorities which have known periods of persecution, etc. With the exception of the fact that, of course, you are not born, or maybe now, you may have people who are born in an LGBTI community, but in the past, basically, people had to realize they were belonging to a community and look out for it. On the second point, certainly, the risk of big data, etc., which is why, you know, conformity, the loss of predictability, etc., it's like an evolutionary response almost. It's like, you know, fishes and birds flying in flocks and animals going around in herds in order to minimize the possibility of being attacked by predators. So this idea of conforming, not becoming inconspicuous, etc., which explains this phenomenon of creating Facebook profiles that will not damage your career prospects.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if we have any more questions, or perhaps we should wrap it up, and I just would like to thank every single panelist and the audience for having this chance to highlight that we definitely need more understanding and research, more participation, and then more access to digital rights as LGBT communities. So thank you very much.
Thank you.